For years, I've been saying I wouldn't take ads on this show, and now suddenly season 4, I'm taking ads. What is up with that? This is Paul Colligan. This is the Podcast Report. This is episode 116, season 4, episode 2, actually. In season 4, I started taking ads here on the show. I haven't taken them in the past, and many of the reasons why I haven't taken them in the past are still there, but let's chat about them. Number one, I don't want to distract from the message. When you do a show about X and then you do an ad about Y, there's a disconnect. Is the juice worth the squeeze? All these questions. I think the power of podcasting, I know the power of podcasting. You have experienced that the power of podcasting has always been getting your message out there. And when you do something that distracts from the message, you can have a problem. Another thing that I don't like, reason number 2, is simply many times an ad will get you off the focus of your true monetization strategies. We'll run the numbers a little bit later in this, but if your show is going to make money from X, running ads in the background, you want to be careful that that doesn't distract, doesn't take the focus off. Number 3, the numbers often don't really warrant it for most podcasts. Maybe the hobbyist podcast, but those you who are making a business out of your podcast is just not enough to pay the bills. And then finally, I'll be honest with you, I have been burned. I've been in this space since before iTunes was in this space. As you know, the podcasting Bible doesn't even mention the iPhone in it because, well, we didn't know about the iPhone when we wrote that thing. And there was this history where there was this dream, there was this fantasy that, we would podcast our passion and the profits would follow. And well, that just doesn't work. You need a strategy, you need a plan. And more often than not, advertising gets in the way. Show notes, links, conversation, and more for this episode can be found at thepodcastreport.com/116. You are the podcaster looking to do great business with your podcast, and this is the show for you. Ads in podcasting. A lot of people do them. Not everybody understands even how they work. I've got Rob Walsh coming in a future episode. He does the ads at Libsyn. He's going to set us straight, give us a bunch of truth into all this. So I'm going to let the majority of the logistics of this come from Rob, but I want to give you an overlook of the idea so you can understand. Podcast ads are most often, and not always, and that's one of the great things about running your own business, running your own podcast, is you can sell however you want, but they're generally sold in CPM, and CPM stands for cost per milli. It's an old advertising term, and it basically means how much do you get per 1,000 downloads. Now, that CPM rate lets everybody basically speak in common language. Obviously, a show with a more tight niche audience is going to have a higher value, but you still sell in CPM. Obviously, the closer you are to the beginning of the broadcast, the more you're going to be able to get for the CPM because the more likely people are to listen to the ad, that type of thing. Remember, in podcasting, we don't get these stats of how much they listened, how many times they listened, if they passed it around or that type of thing. So the CPM model is a great equalizer to, or a great common language, if you will, to sell ads. And that's why it's done. Now, sometimes people will sponsor an episode regardless of how many downloads, or people do different things, but a lot of times it is based on CPM. And with that said and done, and with that whole comment on the whole, the earlier you are in, the more you can sell it for, let me tell you about Fireside. Today's episode is brought to you by Fireside. Fireside's a podcast hosting and analytics platform created by podcasters for podcasters. Fireside was started by Dan Benjamin, the founder of 5x5. Taking everything he's learned since 2009 for making podcasts for a living, he's turned it into a platform for podcasters everywhere at any level of expertise. Fireside has it all. Unlimited uploads, unlimited downloads, massive amounts of real-time and analytics about your unique downloads, super fast CDN for the best download speeds, multiple podcast support, free one-click podcast importing from platforms like Libsyn, FeedPress, Simplecast, SoundCloud, etc., custom domain mapping, beautiful responsive website with your own artwork, host, guest pages, tons of advanced features like sponsorship integration, chapter markers, bookmarks for links, auto-posting of future episodes, time code linking, and a lot more. You can try Fireside for free by 7 days, during which time you can import your existing podcast for free, taking advantage of every feature Fireside has to offer. The unlimited plan starts at just $19 per month. There's no commitment or long-term agreements to worry about. You can visit fireside.fm/podcast report today. Take the tour. If you use the code Paul Sent Me, you'll get 20% off the standard plan for 3 months. Fireside by podcasters for podcasters. Bak bak. I thrilled to have these guys on as the initial sponsor. I did the interview with Dan from Fireside. We will have that out in episode 4 of season 4 here. It's a fascinating platform. Dan's a fascinating guy. I love what they've done. I love what they played with. And take a look. First 7 days is free. You got the coupon code. Make it happen. In the podcasts I work with and in the, for lack of a better term, professional circles that I deal with, most of the podcasters, except a few who kind of teach how to do this, so I don't know if that counts as much, don't take ads. For many of the reasons that I spoke to earlier. They don't want to distract from the message. The monetization strategies just are bigger in getting names and email addresses than they are in doing ads. So this is not a world that I'm necessarily familiar with. Now, what's funny is at the same time, a lot of my clients say, hey, Paul, I want to buy an ad on another podcast. What would be the podcast to buy the ads on? Because I want to get that client base. You know, we all know, we've spoken to this in the past, that the podcaster already has the podcast religion. They already know how to get a show. They already know the power of podcasting. They already know these things. And so if you're going to advertise a show, it would make a lot of great sense to advertise on another podcast, or this way you don't have the knowledge block or the learning that you have to do. This is why the whole podcast interview industry is so tremendous, is because it's just a great way to get more listeners to your show. So I exist in a world, few people are playing, in my world, the larger world, obviously there's a lot of people, it's a huge part of the industry, but in my world, a lot of them aren't doing it, although they want to know about ads for the show. So how did I get into this? I've got a new client, massive numbers when this client launches, where ads are going to be worth looking at, and ads was their monetization strategy. And unlike some of us that I spoke to earlier with these, dreams of greatness, this is greatness. This is decades of greatness. This is proven greatness. And out the door, the downloads are going to happen. So I started looking at the industry. I started speaking to those in charge. I started getting the numbers. I started putting all these things together. And what's interesting is that when the numbers are right, this becomes interesting. Now, I've spoken in the past about shows. I spoke to, Bloomberg with startup saying on that fateful episode, good news, 1.5 million in revenue, bad news, 1.6 million in expenses. Even for this particular client, the ads alone wouldn't cover the cost. But what's great is this client's it's an omnimedia play. The media is going everywhere. So those issues don't come into play. And the entire program could pay for itself through ad insertion and could maybe pay for expansion as well through ad insertion. So it became interesting. And when I started to get to know the people in the industry, when I started running the numbers and that kind of stuff, it became interesting. At the same time, I've got a client who's looking at dynamic ad insertion and what that is. And it's funny, when we do the interview with Dan, you'll hear Dan from Fireside, you'll hear that he is not a fan of dynamic ad insertion. When we bring on Rob, you'll find out that Rob's got some crazy ad insertion technology. So it's not necessarily the end all be all only option, but I got a client looking at ad insertion, starting running that. And what was interesting was just the tech of ad insertion is going to bring this client whose monthly bill was far less than $100 to a situation where his bill probably in the next couple of months would exceed $1,000. So you got to pay for that, amongst other things, and looking at that. So I started playing in the space, and I want to share with you what I've learned. So then Fireside approached me about advertising on the show. And what's interesting about their approach was that I don't make it easy to email me. I have purposely set up a system where it's easy to contact me. It's just not easy to email me, and that's done on purpose, because when it's easy to email you, you get put on lists, you get a lot of bulk content, you get a lot of noise. And you want to communicate with your audience. You want to interact with your audience. But the second you make it just the tiniest little bit of a jump you have to jump through, what happens is then the real communication comes through, and those who have put you on a big list don't come through. So I open up Facebook one day, and on the pro page, there's a message from Fireside that they'd like to chat about sponsoring the show. So the first thing was the realization that This is someone serious, not on a bulk list, not going to be bulk numbers, that type of thing. I appreciated it. Not the first time it's happened. First time it happened actually on Facebook, but I've gotten calls before. I actually once back in the day got a fax from somebody who wanted to advertise on the podcast, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. But this was a serious approach, and the conversation began. And what was neat was the desire was not, I got a lot of money to spend. I got an ad buy I have to get. I need an audience of this size. The idea was, hey, we'd like to reach your audience with the message of what it is that we're doing, which is exactly what I want, exactly what I'd like to see. They realized the niche of what I was doing, and it was never a question of, we're going to pay you this much. It was a question of what would it take to reach your audience. And one of the things that happens in ads, and one of the ways that I think ads will become more popular, is if the dialogue begins to change out of CPM to some sort of metric for engagement or some sort of metric for interaction. I mentioned the term CPM, cost per thousand. It's an old newspaper term. But what's interesting is we can move to CPA, cost per acquisition, where basically you get paid on an affiliate type of situation every time they gain a new customer. The beautiful thing about that is you can pay a lot more, because if you get a new customer and you're making profit, you can pay for that, and you only pay when you've made the profit and that type of thing. But anyway, Fireside approached me. It was a one-off. It was because they realized the niche. It was because they realized the audience. And that intrigued me. And it was funny, as I mentioned earlier, I was looking at ads for one client. I was looking at dynamic ad insertion for another client. I'm putting together the season 4 of the podcast report. And I go, you know what? Let's give it a try this season. Niches is why podcasting is so powerful. The broad podcast is, definitely the money coming into Serial is not a bad thing, but those are the one-offs. There's going to be a couple of dozen of those, in the grand scheme of things. The niche podcast, the podcast that specifically relates to a specific audience with a specific message, that's where the future of this industry is. And the ads that can go to that in the future of this industry are really, really interesting. I have been approached already since Fireside with reaching this audience, realizing that the niche of this audience, you, the podcaster, are looking to do great business with your podcast. This is an audience worth paying more than traditional to access. So make it about the niches, think about the niches, and it becomes interesting. Now, what I've learned so far, some talking points, if you were, to this industry. Number one, there's a big spectrum of what you end up taking home. There's the old adage, it's not how much money you make, it's how much money you keep. The fact of the matter is there are organizations out there who will do your ad repping for you, because you don't want to be making the phone calls. You don't want to be doing the negotiation. You don't want to be doing these things. And, it's an agent, just like a book agent, just like a movie agent, and that type of thing. There's a big range of what people will take. I've heard large organizations from 50% to 20%. And, that's a significant chunk of change. Of course, in the Fireside situation, they came to me directly, so nothing went to an agent, which certainly made things interesting. But the spectrum of people who will rep you is pretty huge. Now, be careful. Well, that's why I'm only going to rep myself. I get that idea, but many of you, your editing is being done by someone else. Your marketing is being done by someone else. Your websites are being done by someone else. Your ad repping should be done by someone else. Your purpose as the podcaster is to reach your audience with the message. Anybody who can help you do that, A, deserves to be paid, but B, you definitely want on your team. It's a big spectrum of what people are willing to rep you. People are willing to bargain. People are willing to negotiate, on the smaller things. Obviously, if it's an audience who's like, if it's a client who's like, well, I got $10,000 to spend on podcasts and I want to get as many as I can for that money. A, I don't even necessarily know if that's a big deal. But B, you're not going to get negotiation there. So think about that. Play with that. That's very, very interesting. And then the other thing that I've learned, and this is really important, is for a while I've been saying, maybe even complaining, and I'm going to stop that, that the other side has to have more realistic expectations. Well, here's the thing. The podcaster has to have realistic expectations as well. Both sides really need to work on managing the expectations in the ad game to do something that is truly the win-win. If you are in charge of your message, if you are in charge of your market, if you are in charge of your media, you need to be in charge of the way ads are done. But then again, at the same time, the person who's putting the ad on your show certainly, well, first of all, don't be the guinea pig. Only deal with people who know what works. Be in a situation as to where, you meet their expectations as well. And it can be at an interesting place. Some of the ads out there, some of the services, kind of claim, oh, just sign up your show and we'll throw in ads and it'll make sense. No, be careful with that. Market to message match is absolutely key. Both sides need to manage expectations. Okay, Paul, so what's the end game here? What are you doing? The podcast report has always been about examining the industry, learning from the greats. Some of the interviews that we have coming in future episodes you're going to love. I will have learned as much as you will have learned, and that's part of why I do this show. We test technologies here, we test mechanisms here, we test ideas here, and definitely in season 4, we're going to be testing advertising. I promise I will share with you my thoughts when all this is over with. We'll probably close season 4 with the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. And if you're listening to this in the past, jump ahead to whatever the end of season 4 is, and that can be fun. But I'm intrigued here. The tech is here to do some interesting things. The money for the niche, which is where you are, which is where I am, that certainly makes it worth looking at, and we're in an interesting place. Now, one of my most successful episodes, one of my most talked about episodes, one of my most intriguing episodes, I don't know what the right term is you want to use. The metrics for this show and its success are obviously very different, but it was the show I did with Ed Rush about buying an audience. How Ed Rush spent some money, bought an audience for his fishing show, and then immediately didn't build it, didn't spend time growing it, bought it. And that's an interesting place. And here's the thing. If you put ads on your show, you know how much the show makes. It's an easy metric. And here's the thing. If you can buy listeners to your show for less than you can make from your show, this game gets to be really interesting. It becomes a very, very interesting product of arbitrage or that type of thing. Certainly an element of the industry to look at as well. Now, I want to be very careful, and I want to very specifically say that you cannot buy people into a niche. This is not a game of manipulation. This is not a game of convincing people to take something they don't want to take. This is a game of, if you have a market, that you've got a message that is going to make you money through the media of podcasting, you definitely want to find as many people as you can in that market to listen to your show, because that's where the money is going to come from. So spending money on that makes a great deal of sense. Now, of course, forcing someone into your niche, forcing someone into your message who's not there to learn it, is going to be a waste of time for you, is going to be a waste of time for them, and is something that you should just not ponder and not even think about. But I definitely want to explore this idea of buying an audience, and we'll be exploring that. And part of that is knowing the value of the show and this interchange, some interesting things that you can do. I mentioned this earlier. I'm going to do ads through the end of this season. We'll see what it looks like. If you're interested in getting your ad on this show, you can email the podcast report at outlook.com, or you can contact me through any of the social ways that we do this. Now, if this is your first show, I would definitely recommend your first episode, definitely recommend going back to episode 115, which would be at thepodcastreport.com/115 to see what's doing there. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So let's give out all the numbers. Thepodcastreport.com/116 for this episode. There's a place to leave comments there. You can go to thepodcastreport.com/Facebook/Twitter. Those are the two main social ones that we're on. If you want to interact with me there, that's a great place to do it. Would love to hear your thoughts. Would love to further the conversation about this. And if we start that conversation, let me know what kind of numbers you're looking at, because if your numbers are really, really low, if you're, you're going for the deep impact, but not the deep downloads, then ads got to pay really, really, really deep and be interesting. It's definitely got to be part of the equation. So ads this season, at the very least, as a means to establish value, as a means to get more revenue, as a means to figure out what you're doing, that's what we're going to play with here. What's interesting is in my model of market, message, money, media, all too often the money is not going to come from ads. It's going to come from how you serve that audience. So the money from ads takes one of two roles. The money from ads comes from, will it help you serve your audience? Now, what's interesting is with Fireside, got a comment on Facebook. Hey, Paul, I'm intrigued with Fireside. I want to take a look at it. I'm helping podcasters do great business with their podcast. Well, look at this. We're in an interesting place, and they have got a chance to try something. I made an introduction. I made a couple of bucks. I do more and more of this, and we could be at a really interesting place. However, if I distracted them from what it is they're trying to do, if this person is one of these ones who jumps from host to host to microphone and never launches, I've actually done a disservice. And I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, how it's going to be, but that's kind of the approach here. So join me on this journey. I have not jumped in full force. Ads are now the future. I'm just seeing the benefits. I'm seeing the opportunities. I'm seeing the power. And so I wouldn't be a good reporter of this industry if I didn't give you the honest truth on what's going on and if I didn't explore it. So thank you for listening to the Podcast Report. My name is Paul Colligan. thepodcastreport.com/116 for all the good stuff. You can reach out to me by email at thepodcastreport@outlook.com or through all of those social interactions. Between now and next week, by the way, next week we've got Michael Stelzner from Social Media Marketing World. He killed the show. One of my most popular episodes in the past was when he added the show. Well, he actually killed that show. And I thought it would be vital to bring him on to talk about what happened there. And then we'll chat a little bit about what he's trying to do with Social Media Marketing World this year. And I think that should be fascinating. The week after that, we've actually got Dan Benjamin for Fireside, which should be fun. And then, the episode number 5, I've got Ed Dale, old friend. Boy, he's going to bring a contrasting model to podcasting that I think will set a lot of you abuzz with ideas and concepts for doing great business with your podcast. So between now and then, do some great business with your podcast. We'll chat next week. Bye.